Okay, looks like most people would have been able to join. So welcome to today's method webinar with Accounting for Nature, Natural Decisions and Kilter Rural. Today I will give the method authors an opportunity to introduce their woodland bird assessment methodology. That's the one of the earliest fauna methods that have been accredited under the Accounting for Nature framework. And if you're here today and you have no idea what Accounting for Nature is, I'm just going to give you a very, very quick rundown. So Accounting for Nature is an environmental accounting organisation. We are a non-for-profit which provides scientifically rigorous ways for people to measure and monitor environmental condition, which also allows them to disclose that condition in a standardised way. So if you're interested in learning more about Accounting for Nature, I will pop a link into the chat where you can sign up for one of our introduction webinars. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A box as we go. We will save all the questions for David and Geoff to the end of the session, at which time we'll go through and answer all of them. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A today. So with that being said, I wanted to introduce the two speakers today. So we have David here, who's the Landscape and Sustainability Analyst at Kilter Rural. And joining him is Geoff Park, who's the Director at Natural Decisions. So David and Geoff, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I guess just a little bit of background about Kilter Rural and why we're in this space. We're a funds manager. We manage investments in both land and water, have done so for the last 15 years or so in Southeast Australia. So yeah, we have a real need to measure what we're doing on farm. So we've been involved in certainly implementing methods under the Accounting for Nature framework as a key means to measure and report condition of our natural assets, but we've also been involved in the development of methods themselves. So our native bird method, which we're woodland bird method, which we're speaking to here, was the third method behind native vegetation and soil. Bear with me, I'll just press to my next slide here. So, yeah, this method was first accredited in November 2021. After a couple of applications of the method and other feedback in the period since, we've been working on a revision to the method, which sort of very neatly has just been approved by Accounting for Nature in the last couple of days. So there'll be a new document, method document available from Accounting for Nature in the very near future. So some other context around our method, it's a level 2 or 3 method, depending on really depending on intensity of survey, and I'll discuss what those thresholds are later. For us, I mean, it's a logical thing for us to want to measure woodland birds. I mean, they're a natural asset in their own right. The method also fits really neatly with our native vegetation method. So, you know, we can essentially apply a similar or the same stratification process that we use in our native vegetation method for our woodland birds. So it's very efficient for us to implement the bird method after all the work we've already done with our native veg method and accounts. But the other thing we're very much aware of is that you know, woodland birds or birds in general are a pretty reasonable indicator of broader ecological condition. So it's just for us a very logical thing to want to be able to measure and report on. So the method has been developed very much from a commercial agricultural perspective. So that's really born out of what we think we can afford and what's practical, and therefore what we can sustain over a prolonged period of time. I mean, Geoff and I have no illusions. It's going to take quite some years of data before we can really start to see significant trends through that data, given the nature of observational bird data. So we've got to be in it for the long haul. The method, of course, was really aligned for application on our managed landscapes. So over time, we've managed about 12,000 hectares of regenerating agricultural land. But the method, or one of the developments in the revision, is that in a sort of explicit way, it's now able to be utilised in not just the woodland eco community that exists in our part of the world, but to other woodland eco communities existing around the country. So that's now explicitly built into the method. So some of the basic fundamentals of the method, it's really optimised to work across large and diversely regenerating agri-ecological farmlands of the type that we at Kilter Rural are managing. On these sorts of landscapes, I guess we have a really wide range of woodland condition across our properties. Generally, we may have a few isolated remnants, but largely we've got degraded vegetation areas that have been subsumed into the agricultural system over time, and we're trying to regenerate parts of those farmlands back into their original native virgin state. So typically, it's in terms of assessment units, what we report on by the method. It's sort of that varying woodland condition that we use as a reporting basis. Very neatly, and we owe a lot to these people, but the method utilises the empirically derived woodland bird calculation that Fraser et al. 2018 developed. So this sort of is, Geoff will talk about this in more detail shortly, but the work of Hannah Fraser, Martine Moron and her University of Queensland colleagues done a lot of work in an empirical sense to generate some fundamental mathematical equations that can be used to determine bird condition from survey. But more about that shortly from Geoff. But the method also uses in the field, utilises the standard 2 hectare 20-minute field survey technique that's been around for almost 40 years now, I believe, Geoff. It's a standard technique used by BirdLife Australia and others. So without further ado, I might just throw over to Geoff, who could just sort of step us through the condition calculation aspect of the method before I return to talk about accounting areas and stratification and so forth. But I'll throw to you, Geoff.
Thanks, David. I'll just check that you can hear me okay, because disconcertingly, I'm appearing twice on the screen, so that's worrying. But anyway, Hannah's nodding, so that's great. Just a quick introduction. So I'm part of a small consulting team called Natural Decisions. We work largely in environmental decision making, and we've worked with Kilter now for close to 15, almost 20 years. We were involved when they first set up way back in the day, and we've had a very strong working relationship with them. Most of our work is in agricultural landscapes where you're looking at fragmented and sort of highly degraded systems a lot of the time. And because personally I've had a strong interest in woodland birds for a long time, that was one of the things that we sort of started thinking about with Kilter probably 4 or 5 years ago, I think, David, when the first accounting for nature methods were being developed and applied on Kilter properties. So yeah, it's been quite a journey to get to this point, but as we'll mention in later on through the webinar, we're really keen to see this method shared and applied and developed over time. So no one should look at it as being a sort of a perfect sort of method at this point in time. I think it's going to benefit from, development and application. David's already mentioned the paper that Hannah Fraser and Martine Marin published back in 2018. I can't sort of emphasise strongly enough how fundamental this piece of work has been to developing the method. It's I think it's a really good example of where some basic research was done, which combined looking at lots and lots of bird data, but also expert elicitation with a bunch of people, some of possibly in the room today, to sort of come up with a way of thinking about the condition of woodland bird communities. And essentially, if you've got some survey data and you apply the equations, which I'll come to in a moment, that Hannah and co-developed, you can come up with a site-based score of between 0 and 1, which gives you a citer on the condition of the woodland bird community at that site. And that can then be translated into an econt. Now, it's really important to emphasise that it's telling you about the condition of the woodland bird community, not the woodland itself. So in theory, you could have a really degraded woodland site, but for whatever reason, it could have quite a few species of woodland birds and with different attributes, and that could give you quite a, an elevated condition score. And of course, there'll always be a really strong relationship between the condition of the habitat and the bird community, but it's important to note that distinction. So there's some equations which underline the calculation of the condition score, and I won't even attempt to give you the mathematical reasoning behind these equations. I'll just go into a vortex that I'll never get out of. But essentially, the work that David and I did, where we're using the relationship between a couple of indicator variables in southeastern Australia, which were specifically about species richness, that is the number of native species that occur at a site, and secondly, the proportion of those species that were small-bodied. So that's about 50 grams. I mean, 50 grams is the threshold, although there are some birds, annoyingly, that can sort of be 49 or 51 grams. So you have to make a bit of a judgment as to how you apply the categorisation there. But essentially, there's a couple of calculation steps there that use a logistical regression model that help you understand, with those two bits of information, what the site-based condition for the woodland bird community is at that site. And the way that the model works is that if you've got lots of native species and a high proportion of those native species are small-bodied, you will start to approach reference condition, which would be a score of 1. So that's essentially the, I suppose, the frame that the maths sort of operates within. Now, this slide here, the red arrow points at what's called the temperate southeastern mainland Australian bird community, which is the landscape that David and Kilter Rural are operating in. And the paper that Hannah Fraser and co developed actually looked at the woodland bird communities in different sorts of woodland biomes across Australia, which are represented in this map. And there's a nice little table in that paper which breaks down the different ecoregions and highlights what the mathematical relationships are between species richness and the other two variables that are of interest, which in our case was the proportion of small-bodied native species. So things like, pardalotes and thornbills and robins, etc. Whereas if you go to Tasmania, different woodland bird community, and what the foundational research showed was that in Tasmania, it's a slightly different story. It's not the proportion of small-bodied native species that matters. It's actually the proportion of native species that are associated with intact habitat systems. So depending on where you are in Australia, there'll be a choice to be made between those two indicators. In all cases, it's native species richness, but sometimes it's about the proportion of small-bodied species, and sometimes it's about the proportion of intact native species. Now, there's a useful addendum, which is part of the paper, which actually breaks down the woodland bird species list, if you like, and assigns these species to each of these categories, depending on where you might be in the ecoregions across Australia. So, David, I think that's me done for now.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. It might also be worth mentioning at this point that Accounting for Nature continuing some work to try and expand this beyond just woodlands and to enable us to deal with grasslands and shrublands. So in the fullness of time, I think we can all foresee a quite encompassing method, which this current method might just become subsumed within it, that enables woodland bird condition to be calculated for any ecological biome across the country. So it's certainly the method as it is an exciting place, I guess, just in terms of it being one point in time in a very much developing space. So I'm going to talk about accounting areas and stratification, defining assessment units, and shortly I'll go to an example that will make this sort of very, very clear. But I guess just some starting points. The accounting area for the method, it's different to, say, native vegetation. Native vegetation needs to take account of your entire project. So whether you've got native vegetation currently in existence or not. The accounting area for the bird method just applies to that area of your farmland or project that is existing native vegetation, whether that's a remnant or whether it's an area planned to be restored to native vegetation, that is of pre-1750 woodland reference, so that naturally there was woodland existing in that part of the project. So once you've defined the accounting area, you stratify it to in order to be able to distribute surveys equitably across the accounting area. And we use a combination of generalised condition of the woodland environment and also local woodland type to discretise that accounting area for survey. It's generally the generalised condition categories that you apply that are the assessment units in the account, but that need not necessarily be the case. There might be an argument to use the woodland subtypes that occur across your project as the primary assessment units. But as Geoff sort of remarked before, just because you've got woodland of a certain condition, it doesn't necessarily mean that the condition of the woodland bird community is necessarily going to be entirely linear with condition of the habitat. So using generalised condition categories actually gives some resolution to get a handle on that question, I guess. So survey sites are distributed across the stratification, as I've mentioned, and the aim is to focus on achieving the same sampling intensities within the individual assessment units that are required for the level 2 or 3 confidence. So a level 2 confidence in our method means that you need to have at least one survey every 25 hectares. For a level 3, the intensity, well, you need to have at least one survey every 150 hectares. So that's sort of the basic discriminator between level 2 and level 3. The method assumes that you will, and not that you're restricted to this, of course, but the minimum standard is that you apply one survey per year, and that for each survey site, you're applying one habitat hectare survey at that site. But that's sort of just the minimum requirement. So I'm just going to go through by example with our Gagari project, which sits in central northern Victoria, about an hour northeast of Bendigo, where I'm sitting at the moment. So our farm area, we have just over 1,800 hectares distributed across about 10 non-contiguous properties across that area. So it's a dispersed farmland. The accounting area works out to be about 290 hectares. So that's the area of woodland reference, or where woodland originally occupied, that we're managing for environmental biodiverse outcomes. So in our case here, we have sort of 3 main ecological vegetation communities that are woodland related, and they're the plains woodland, grassy woodland, and lunette woodland. So they're basically subtypes of woodland from the southeast Australian mainland biome that we have occurring across our area. So getting into more detail about stratification. So we decided, from a commercial perspective, we could afford about 2 days survey each year of woodland birds. So we equate that to about 20 sites over that 2-day annual measurement period. And so that gives you, applying 20 surveys, gives you a survey intensity of 14.6 hectares per survey. So we're well within the level 2 confidence level. As I said, for level 2, you require at least one survey every 25 hectares. So then the task is to distribute those surveys across your accounting area. And so there's essentially, in this table here, there's a matrix. So along the top there, in the heading with the heavier shade, EBCs. So you can see we've got 4 woodland types basically represented. And then on the in the vertical, we've got our generalised condition categories for our vegetation. So we've got 3 categories, from remnant through to just clumps of scattered farm trees, and then our other condition categories where we've got no trees or they're very isolated in a farmland context. And I've got some images just to be a bit more definitive about what we're meaning by that shortly. So you can see in that matrix, we've distributed our 20 samples, and so the aim is to achieve that L2, that level 2 confidence threshold for both each of the EVC categories, but also for the generalised condition categories. So if you look at the very bottom line, and if you look at the very right-hand column, you'll see the survey intensities for each of those strata groups. And you can see all bar one, we actually meet the threshold for L2. There is one little outlier there. You can see for absent isolated trees, our survey intensity is sitting at 33, which is a little bit above the threshold. There is a bit of a trade-off here because obviously, inclined, and sort of reasonably so, I think, to want to certainly monitor your more disparate, better quality patches of woodland vegetation. And you're not going to be as inclined to want to over-measure those larger areas of the farmland where you've got little or no vegetation of woodland trait. So there is just a little bit of a trade-off at play there, and all that needs to be described and justified within the information statement for the project as to sort of why some of those intensities might vary. This just gives you a more visual idea of the types of woodland condition categories we're dealing with, and these are all on our Gary farmlands. But the left image there, I mean, it's a bit hard to tell from aerial, but the left image there is a remnant site, so it's obviously got mature box trees, woodland box trees, but there's also some coherent understory and emerging mid-story. So there's really good structure across that part of one of our farms. That was actually a reasonably physically protected area on the original farm that we purchased. A second really common context on our farmland is where you've got in a open agricultural paddock situation where you might have a clump or scattering of well-defined scattering of trees, but generally there's little or no understory, native understory developed in association with the mature crown. So that's sort of a mid-level category, if you like. And then our situation that is perhaps more vastly the case across our farmland, because we are regenerating land that was originally intensively operated agriculturally. We are dealing with large areas of, for instance, former pasture that we're direct seeding, and with the intention to regenerate to a woodland type ecosystem. So in that situation, like, you've got nothing on the ground, either in the form of any native cover, native ground cover, or even you might just have perhaps the odd in paddock farm tree comprising that particular condition category. So it's these condition categories that we tend to use to define the assessment units for the method. So I'll now throw back to Geoff, who will speak more specifically to survey on the ground and then how that data is worked up to deliver an econ. Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, David. So just a couple of brief points here. The first one is that the method is based on a survey technique that was developed by Richard Loyne way back in the mid-80s, 1986, the 2-hectare, 20-minute survey technique. And that's been sort of widely adopted as a standard method for bird surveying for decades now. And one of the terrific things is because so many surveys have been collected through this technique, there's potential to apply the method retrospectively to existing survey data. As David explained before, the trick there will be to think about how you might stratify your surveys if it was done in some sort of systematic way. There's a big trade-off here between how many surveys you would like to do and how many you can actually afford to do. And, you know, it'd be great if you could do, I don't know, you could survey every season or each of the 4 seasons, and you could do multiple surveys at a site. That would be a beautiful thing, but it's often outside the resources of landholders or land managers to do that. And one of the things we've been trying to do with this method is to come up with an approach that is actually accessible to even to individual farmers if they were interested, without it costing them an arm and a leg. So in the case of the Kilter application, we're looking at 1 survey per year, which, you know, you could argue is not enough, but it's what can be realistically afforded by the project and still deliver some really good information. It's important that the surveys are done by people with some reasonably high level of expertise in bird identification and survey work, but obviously this is another area of trade-off, because you'll have some surveyors who may not have quite the elite level of expertise, but that is just one of the constraints that we have to deal with in terms of applying the method. It's going to take, you know, many years, probably in a lot of cases, to be confident of the long-term trends. But I think one of the beaut things about the method is you can do 1 survey at 1 site and you can get some early insights about what the condition of the woodland bird community might be. And if you think back to David's graphic on the previous slide, you know, there's a landscape there which is a biological desert at present, but over time, as that landscape is restored and you get some shrub, understory and trees coming back, there will be a pretty rapid improvement in the condition score, even at quite what might look like a degraded site. And there's lots of evidence from that from other studies of the effect of revegetation on bringing back woodland bird communities. So I think it provides just another line of sight on how you would assess how particular sites are tracking through time. Thanks, Dave. So too much data here to really absorb in, you know, a minute or two, but essentially this is just a snapshot of some of the site data that have been captured at Gurgari through one of the surveys. You can see that it's broken down in terms of the EVCs, but more importantly, the condition sort of categories that David just explained, remnant, clumps and isolated trees. And it just shows you the survey results there. You know, you've essentially got the species richness and the number of those species that are native, and then proportion of those that are small-bodied. So that's just captured directly from the survey information. It's then taken through the sausage machine of the metric and calculates a site econ for each of those sites. And you can see there's a high degree of variation or variability there. You've got some sites that are down sort of 15 or 20 out of 100. So you could sort of reasonably expect those to be pretty ordinary in terms of woodland bird community condition. But you can see that there are some sites up over 50, which are quite high. Thanks, Dave. Next one. And this is just the process for then calculating the econs. So you can see for the three different assessment units, remnant, clumps and isolated, you've got the native species richness and the proportion of small-bodied converted into a condition metric for each of those three assessment units. And you can see that, interestingly, with the Kilter landscape, there's not much difference in the condition metric between the remnants and the scattered tree sites, but they're quite a lot higher than the isolated trees, which is sort of what you'd expect. But I think one of the reasons there's not a great deal of difference between remnant and scattered is because you're essentially sitting in a very disconnected landscape. So even where there are remnants, they're often relatively small and not very connected to large forest blocks, or large woodland blocks, which would probably bump up the score. We know from applying the method in a few different places that those sorts of differences in terms of landscape connectivity are pretty significant. I think I'm done. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Geoff and David. If anyone listening in have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. I'm afraid you guys might have been too clear so far and there's no questions in the Q&A. That's what happens when you know what you're talking about.
There's got to be at least one question. You could come up with a question, Amanda, couldn't you?
Well, actually, I do have questions, so I might just kick this off. I was wondering, when you go out and do the bird surveys, is there any birds that you don't want in the landscape, and how do you identify those? Do you have a list of birds you would be expecting in a specific area? Are there things like invasive birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. Dave, do you want to have a go, or do you want me to?
No, far away, Geoff.
Yeah, so there are lots of, certainly in the types of landscapes that David is managing, you know, you've got things like house sparrows and Indian miners and starlings, which are unwanted birds, if you like. So in a sense, you would be recording those species, but they're not actually degrading the condition score per se. It's really the number of native species and the proportion of those that are small-bodied. Now, that's the case with exotic species like the ones I've mentioned. I mean, the chances are that if you've got some of those species in a site, they will be inhibiting the presence of some of the species that you're hoping for. So that's how that plays out. But at the end of the day, it's actually just the number of native species and the proportion of small-bodied species that drives the condition score. Now, the other factor, of course, is you often have, there's the case of noisy miners in particular, which are, you know, a native honeyeater that have the ability to exclude and outcompete small birds on sites. And again, they would just be recorded as part of the species richness, but the effect of those species, particularly in remnants that are fragmented, is that they will, by their behaviour, drive down particularly the number of small bird species that you're likely to get.
Yeah.
And this is sort of discussed in a little bit more detail in the method itself. Yeah.
Thank you. David, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just, please correct me if I'm a bit off beat, Geoff, but with some of the other woodland ecotypes, though the native species or the species richness might be maintained as a key indicator, the second key indicator might not necessarily revolve around small-bodied birds, but it might be those birds that are known to reside in intact woodland bird communities. So, you know, the definition around the subset of birds that that are being referenced here is tightened.
That's correct. Yeah. So this is covered. This is covered in some detail in the appendix to Hannah Fraser's paper, but like if you go into a different biome and the condition is driven by the proportion of what we call intact species, then those species are actually nominated, and I can't recite these off the top of my head, but for example, in my landscape, if it was intact species, you'd be looking at things like hooded robins and diamond firetails and the like that are associated with better habitat and more connected habitat. So that will be the case for the species list in, I think it's in Western Australia and Tasmania, but possibly some other biomes as well.
Yeah. All right, thank you. We have had a few questions pop into the chat, so I'm just going to start in the order they were posted. Shakira is asking 2 questions. I might answer the first one and then I'll pass the second one on to you guys. So the first question is, when will the new method go online? And so basically there's just some minor tweaks to be done. The method has already been approved, and so we're expecting this to be finalized in the coming few weeks. But you will notice if you go to the website that you need to select request the method. So you can do that now, and once the new method has been finalized, we can send that to you. The second question I'm going to hand over to you guys is, will there be an Excel template for calculations using condition metrics, formulas, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. That's a great question. So we have because we've applied the method, we've got quite a well-developed spreadsheet that forms the basis of our accounts, quite obviously. That sort of streamlines the whole calculation process. So, I'm certainly happy to share that to the basic template to anyone that's interested in it. It's obviously not part of the explicitly part of the method itself, but certainly happy to sort of share that upon request. It's not a very pretty looking thing, but it's certainly functional and is pretty logically laid out. I think the other thing worth mentioning at this point, Amanda, we were discussing it before we came online here, that Accounting for Nature going through a program at the moment where they hoping to be able to automate a lot of this sort of stuff via an online portal that's sort of tailored to the various methods that are out there. So yeah, you might want to say something more about that, Amanda.
Yeah, sure. And Shakira, as one of our experts, might have heard about this as well before. So we are developing an online accounting platform. We're expecting it to be released before the end of the year, and that will, make spreadsheets redundant is the idea. And so you'll enter data onto your phone or onto your computer, and that will calculate the econ for you. Thank you. Next question is from Blair, who is wondering about the applicability of the method in WA.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. The method is perfectly applicable in WA. You'll just have to use a slightly different equation, and I can't remember off the top of my head which of the indicators would apply, but if you're talking about woodland ecosystems in WA, it's perfectly transferable, and the method as it's being accredited will outline all of that.
Thank you, John. Next question is a somewhat tricky one. Sorry, that's my dog. Very good. Hey, so Sonia is wondering how you make money from this. And so whilst I don't think there's any direct monetary purposes behind measuring woodland bird condition, David, I'm not sure if you want to answer anything about the reasons for why Kilter is doing an environmental account.
Yeah, certainly from a general perspective, we're really keen on leveraging the eco-service markets where we can. That's we do regenerate a lot of our country, up to 30%, to enable production of ecosystem services, largely through native vegetation and so forth. So that does take land away from agricultural pursuits, of course. So whether that's via carbon or via measured improvement in biodiversity that, could happen entirely in its own right going forward, or it could happen as a co-payment on top of any carbon that you've sequestered. So there's all that opportunity there. But I think that birds specifically, it's hard to sort of see at this point how you can strictly use that at this point in time in a monetary sense. As we've said, it's going to take many years of data to sort of see trends, or likely see trends through inherently noisy observational data. So, but yeah, you never know. But I suppose we're pinning most of our monetisation opportunity, I guess, really on demonstrated improvement in native vegetation and soil condition. Anything further to add there, Geoff?
I thought the question was about how you and I make money out of this, Dave. And, we just develop the method and then we go and sit on the banana lounge and we retire. But no, I think your answer's good. And I mean, the reality is that birds are charismatic. People are interested in birds. And I think this is a way of actually just providing another way to interpret the bird survey results for areas. I mean, I've spent a couple of decades looking at bird survey reports where someone said, we found 27 birds, and some of them were really special ones and some were boring common ones. But often it's very hard to compare those survey results. And so I think this is a really neat way to compare, what can be a mass of data.
Thank you. Next is also a tricky question. I might just give it a try to answer it first, and then I'll pass on to see if you guys have any comments. But it's from Jim, who's asking if the method has any crossover with newly announced Australian government biodiversity certificates and if there are synergies. And to answer a very complex question quite shortly, I would say that we do not have the specific details yet of that biodiversity certificate schemes. So saying if a specific method can be utilised or if accounting for nature can be utilised within that biodiversity certificate scheme is just a bit too soon. But we are hoping to have more final answers throughout the year. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
No, nothing sensible.
Yeah. That's all good. So wait and see, Jim. There's also a question about the presence of large birds of prey. So the question says, I'd imagine this signals a strong ecosystem, but would be lowering the ecosystem or the econ score.
So I can take this one. Perhaps an easy way to explain this is imagine you had two sites and they both had the same species, same native species, and the same proportion of small-bodied species. And then suddenly you added a brown goshawk to one of those sites. That would still increase the econ score, the site condition score, but it wouldn't increase it by as much as if a striated pardalote popped in and became that additional species. So essentially it's the proportion of small-bodied species, at least in the southeastern biome, that drives up that score more so. So hopefully that's a simple answer to, which is a really good question.
Thank you. David is asking if there are any statistical basis to the prescribed sampling intensities.
That's a really good question, and I don't know whether I have a super specific answer for that. I mean, we certainly argued the case from a practicality and affordability point of view. This is what we could do, and we felt that based on relative variation in intensity that you might be able to achieve, that we could argue an L2 or an L3. Certainly the method has sort of been through the full process of review by Accounting for Nature and the experts that they pull in to help assess these things, and they're obviously comfortable with where we've set our thresholds. So there are, I think, the whole guidelines around developing bird methods, they're still in a provisional state. You might be able to correct me on that, Amanda. So I think there's still a lot of, there's still a bit of work and thought going into those guidelines and where they should ultimately sit. So I think it's a little bit of a fluid area at the moment. But I think because we're only surveying, the minimum standard is a once a year survey, albeit seasonally consistent, and a singular survey per site. That sort of keeps the level of confidence down a little. So certainly we're never advocating that it would be an L1, level 1 level of confidence outcome with the method. Jeffrey?
No, that's good, Dave.
Thank you, David. And just for the benefit of the person asking the question, in case you're not very familiar with the Accounting for Nature framework, the L's that David has been referring to refers to the level of accuracy associated with the econ score. So a level 3 is 80% accuracy, level 2 is 90, and level 1 is 95% accuracy. So we have a science accreditation committee that is independent body of researchers that go through and review all the methods that are being submitted to us, and they make sure that the sampling method that has been suggested produces a score that aligns with that level of accuracy that the method is assigned to. So I might go ahead and answer the next question, which is asking if we see a future where the econ score can be linked to carbon offset units. And this is already happening. So the econ can be linked with the carbon offset units in Queensland through the Land Restoration Fund. And so that's been going on for a few years now. We are also developing guidelines on how the econ score can be linked to carbon offsets more broadly, both in Australia, but also at an international scales. So those guidelines should hopefully be out soon, so you can see, if you're not in Queensland, how you could link it outside of Queensland. So Jim has a question regarding revegetation. So the question states, has there been any results from revegetation sites at different year stages compared to remnant woodland sites?
So Dave?
Yeah, look, it's I think it's too early to tell just yet. As Geoff alluded to before, just based on generalised condition, we are seeing some differences in average site condition score, especially when you drop down from concentrated clumps or remnant trees down to sort of the more open and currently degraded area, and sort of slowly being restored areas of the farmland. So we certainly sort of see some inklings at that level, but I think until we get a few more years of, I'm looking forward to say in a couple of years' time, when we have a couple more surveys under our belt, that we can start to look a bit more deeply into that question with a bit higher resolution.
I think this is where there's an opportunity to look at retrospective activities. Like if you had a landscape that had revegetation in it of various ages, you could stratify that using some sensible technique. It might be things that are less than 5 years old, things that are areas that are more than 5 or whatever. And I think you could rapidly pick up, or at least see whether there are any differences emerging. So that's where we're really keen to see the method picked up and applied in different contexts.
Thank you. I might give the next question a crack first, and then I'll hand over to you guys if you want to add anything. So the question is asking if you can use woodland bird data that has been collected using other methods than the standardized search. So either presence absence data from point counts or transects. So in general, under the Accounting for Nature framework, the data collection needs to align with the method you're using in order to have a certifiable econ score. There are options of hindcasting econs, which doesn't necessarily fully align with an accredited method. And that means that you estimate what that econ would have looked like, but it might not be able to be certified. So we have guidelines available on our website on how you can hindcast data and how similar your data collection needs to be to a method to be able to either be estimated to an econ or have a certifiable econ. David and Geoff, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, just something really quickly, Amanda. I was talking to a group from another state who had got they'd collected some 2 hectare, 20-minute survey data for a bunch of sites. It was like, oh, great, I've got some good data here that we could use. But the problem was that they'd actually had like 10 people doing the survey at the same time. So the 2 hectare, 20-minute survey method is sort of, it sort of assumes you've got an individual observer. So obviously, like my blunt answer to the question was going to be no, but as Amanda's pointed out, you could look at some, if you could develop some correlations between different survey techniques, or if in fact you had some data where it was collected in a slightly different way for 2 hectare, 20-minute, you might be able to come up with some relationships, but it's designed for, as it's described.
Yeah. Thank you.
I might just add there also, Geoff, is that we also, with the 2 hectare, 20-minute technique, also generally collecting abundance data as well. Now, at the moment, our method doesn't use abundance in any way to inform a condition score, but in an ideal world, abundance is something that you'd want to take into account. But at least that data is being collected, and hopefully might be able to be used sometime in the future when our methods become a bit more advanced.
Yep.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions in the Q&A. So the first one is from Blair, who's wondering how the method deals with diverse habitat types. So if you have multiple different types of, woodland, mallee, shrubland on your land, and if they can be remnant or restored, those landscapes.
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. I think that this comes down to thinking carefully about the stratification approach. So the method itself is sort of generally applicable pretty much anywhere in woodlands, but how you stratify your survey sites, I think that's something that it will vary according to the different contexts that you're operating in. So if you think about vegetation types, about landscape fragmentation, it could be to do with revegetation, ages, as I alluded to before. So yeah, that's something that will have to be tailored.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add to that we gave an example in the presentation that was very much about what worked for us. but there is enough latitude in the method to be able to take into account those considerations, as just mentioned by Geoff. You know, what is actually suitable for that particular project, and then you justify your approach, your specific approach ultimately in your information statement for your project.
Thank you. So final question for today, because we are running out of time, is from Luke, who firstly wanted to thank you guys for the presentation. He is wondering if you've had a chance yet to apply your method retrospectively to a longer term data set.
It's in train. There's a project that I've had some association with in Central Victoria called Connecting Country, which has got 2 hectare, 20-minute survey data going back to about 2010. And they've got lots and lots of surveys, like hundreds of surveys. And the stratification at the start of those survey sites was quite neat. Andrew Bennett, who's a landscape ecologist, used to be at Deakin, and he's now, not sure where Andrew is these days. He helped us with the stratification. So that group is actually doing an analysis of the data at the moment and going to be really interested to see what they come up with. So yeah, stay tuned.
Great, thank you. With that, I want to say thank you so much, David and Geoff, for joining me today at this webinar. In case anyone is listening in today and missed parts of it, don't worry. The session will shortly be uploaded to our YouTube channel if you want to go back and have a listen. And if you do have any questions relating to accounting for nature or questions relating specifically to the method that you didn't get a chance to ask today, please send an email to info@accountingfornature.org, and we are happy to respond or forward any questions we receive. So thank you all and have a lovely day.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks all.